CityCast from Explocity.
New Friends and Bombs, 12th to 19th August 1942. There was a new boy at school, and that was always an exciting thing. Thambi, basking in the knowledge of being one of the few 12-year-olds in the 6th class, pushed his way to the front of the crowd surrounding this Sumit Bose, and the others respectfully fell back. There are advantages to excelling in studies and sports, and Thambi was one of those rare beings who wore both invisible crowns on his head. The new boy had a wide grin and freshly oiled curls plastered on his forehead, some of them already springing back rebelliously. Thambi liked the look of him. "Where have you come from?" he demanded. "From Calcutta," Sumit said immediately. He added almost cheekily, "Do you know where it is?" "Of course I do." Thambi's fondness for maps had been fostered on his father's lap at an early age. Appa would fetch the John Bartholomew Atlas from the shelf, and then father and son would pore over its crinkled pages, tracing different parts of the world with their fingers, marveling at how big it actually was and the magic involved in compressing it onto a few pages. Calcutta was in the east and on the coast. Why had this boy come all the way from there? Almost as if he could read Thambi's mind, Sumit said, "I'm here with my mother. My Baba sent us here because of the bombings." Bombings? The word took on a dark form and hovered in the classroom air. Something clawed at the back of Thambi's throat. "The Japanese," supplied Sumit helpfully. "They came to Calcutta in their planes with bombs." "Did you see them?" burst out Gundu Raghavan, a particular friend of Thambi, so named because he was spectacularly thin and Gundu meant fat, so it had been the obvious choice of epithet. Sumit nodded his head solemnly. "They were huge, and they made so much noise my head almost burst. I was standing right below them, and then I saw the bombs falling almost on top of me, and I ran and ran. I'm a very fast runner, so I managed to reach home, but it was close." And then, later, he would tell Thambi and Gundu the truth, that he was asleep at home, in fact, when the bombing happened at the opposite end of the city, but that his father became very uneasy and decided to send his family away to his distant cousin in Tanjore to keep them safe. "She married a Tamilian years ago and everyone made a fuss, but I quite like her and my uncle," observed Sumit. "They don't eat fish, of course. It's a strictly vegetarian family, but I don't really mind idli and sambar and chutney and all that." Thambi nodded, his mood a bit somber. They were not too far from Madras and the coast themselves. What was to prevent the Japanese from bombing areas that lay south of Calcutta? They might even come further inland to Tanjore, and then what would happen? His heart began to beat faster as he thought of little Padma and his parents, and of himself. Would they all remain safe? Would the Japanese take over their land? Would the British be able to fight them back? But what if they actually left India due to Mahatma Gandhi's latest call? What would happen then?
The great author Gustav Flaubert once said, "The art of writing is the art of discovering what you believe." But I'm not buying that entirely. I believe that the art of writing is to make others believe what you want them to believe. And by that I don't mean only storytelling, I mean all writing. Direct and compelling prose can raise even the most academic and arcane subjects to literature. Sometimes academicians couch their findings in thick and opaque prose at times because they don't know how to express themselves in a more comprehensible manner, in simple sentences without using jargon for crutches. Sometimes because they think that they won't be taken seriously if they express themselves in a less formal style. But some of them are great writers and storytellers too. And these go looking for an outlet for their creativity. Happily, some find it. My guest today is author and historian Devika Rangachari. Clearly, she found her muse. She is both versatile and prolific. Her writing has spanned everything from a postdoctoral thesis on 10th century women rulers of Orissa to books for children. Reading Devika Rangachari is a delight. Her latest book is titled Train to Tanjore and is the absorbing account of a young schoolboy who battles small-town orthodoxy in the time of World War II. Devika captures the period and the honest sentiment that characterized R.K. Narayan, Swami, and friends. And she does this with her unique literary sparkle. As you can tell, I enjoyed reading this book. I equally enjoyed reading some of her academic writing, and today I'm delighted to be able to share her with you. So here she is, joining me from her home in Doha, Qatar. Devika Rangachari, welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this.
My pleasure entirely. But before we get to the pedagogy, let's get an important thing out of the way first. You say you like chocolate and potatoes. Not at the same time, surely.
Sometimes at the same time. I remember one of my publishers, in order to celebrate this movie deal for one of my books, called me over for a chocolate dinner.
And?
Where she made potatoes with chocolate and rajma with chocolate, and of course dessert with chocolate. And it was wonderful. So yeah, although I would ideally like them separate, but it was great fun to have them all together.
Okay, I'm not judging, but it does remind me of that book. You remember it? It goes, surely you're joking.
Mr. Feynman.
Mr. Feynman, yeah. Totally delightful book. All right, let's plunge in. Your writing has covered a range of genres, from history, including gender-specific history, to children's books. Now, that's not typical. To what do you ascribe this versatility?
Well, actually, I started writing quite early, and when I was in my college years, and I wrote largely about my school experiences, that sort of thing. But then when I actually took to gender studies in a major way with my doctoral and postdoctoral work, I realized that writing, historical fiction from a gender perspective for young adults would probably make a lot of sense, because whenever I used to do school sessions, interactions with children in schools, they would, first of all, look very dismayed whenever I mentioned the word history, and when I told them about my background, because they're studying history, and then they would say this is the most boring subject in the world, and so on and so forth. But then when I actually started to question them about the women that they knew about in Indian history, they would draw collective blank. And I've done this one exercise in all schools that I've been to across the country, where I would say, okay, so did women exist during the Indus Valley civilization, the Harappan civilization? And the instinctive answer everywhere would be no. And then I'd say, stop and think about it. And then they'd say, oh, okay, no, of course. And they'd look very sheepish. But then it's a factor of the way they've been taught, because the writing of history is male-centered. It is basically his story that they are reading. It has very little to do with the women of the past. And this history that I study, which is based on coins, inscriptions, texts, and actual sources, tell you a very different story. One in which women have been, almost as powerful or even more powerful than men in particular phases of the past, and whose experiences cannot be invisibilized in the manner in which they have been.
That's interesting, but how did you address it?
So I decided to start writing on some of the remarkable women that I had uncovered in the course of my research.
And did it work the way you wanted it to?
They do, after all, think that history is interesting. And then they wonder why history can't be taught in this manner, based on historical fiction.
Right.
And why women have been, more or less obliterated from the historical narrative.
And that's not just typical of Indian history only, right?
It's not just typical of Indian history, but it's all over the world. It's ubiquitous. So that's, of course, a huge gender debate, and all the problems that are there in the writing of the past. But that probably explains my being versatile, as you kindly decided to dub it. But largely on history, but a lot of other things besides.
Speaking of which, a simple question: is it more difficult to write for kids or for adults?
For kids, definitely, because they're a very demanding and discerning audience, and they have too much on their hands and too much on their minds. And so if you're not able to grab them within the first, few paragraphs or so, then your book is lost to them. So the challenge is so much more. An adult reader would typically have more patience, would know that, sometimes narratives are not always, they don't always grab you by the throat in the beginning. They sort of ease you into the story. And so they would give you that amount of time that you require to build your plot. But But children are not going to do that.
Not in journalism.
Yes, absolutely true. And of course, it becomes doubly challenging when you're writing on history, because this is a subject that 99.9% of them dislike. And so if what you write is something which resembles their textbooks, or some kind of a dry narrative, they're going to run from it. So it's tougher.
So is writing simply and clearly central to your ethic?
Yes, writing is central, but having said that, I can write extremely heavy, impenetrable academic prose as well. So I sort of straddle these two worlds of being able to write that kind of prose for an adult academic audience, as well as something that's accessible.
Why? Because you feel that you need to?
Yeah, you need to. Otherwise, it's not given enough. It is not weighty enough. It is not, considered
Right, that's true.
good enough. Yes.
So let's move on to your academic study titled From Obscurity to Light. A wonderful paper. I confess I read it in one sitting till a few moments ago.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Now, this paper focused on a subject about women rulers in Orissa, and I had no knowledge about this at all. I didn't know they existed. So it made it all the more fascinating. In history, we only learnt about women rulers, the obvious ones, Razia onwards. So this paper was your thesis?
This was a postdoctoral thesis, which actually was feeding off my doctoral research, which was based on women in early medieval North India, that's the 7th to 12th century CE, and on the fact that women are actually hidden in plain sight. They're right there in all the sources of history, but the secondary sources that actually construct these historical narratives either remove them or trivialize their presence. So I'm not just talking about women who rule, I'm also talking about non-royal women, just the ordinary women. You can't lump them in one amorphous category and say the status of women rose or fell like a seesaw. That is the want of most sources of history. So it's an enormous field of study, and it's not really given its due. So I think there's so much more that we need to uncover as far as that is concerned.
In particular, I was taken up by the account of the women of the Baumakara dynasty.
Baumakara dynasty. Perfect, yes.
Nailed it. Well, in that dynasty, you had 7 women rulers, one of them a regent, but 4 in succession, rather unusual. Now, the world has known women warriors, like I said, from Razia onwards, not completely unknown. And the presumption is a hostile environment towards women, and that's why it seemed unusual. But in Obscurity, your paper, you write, and I quote, "A woman was considered a valid occupant of the Baumakara throne, and that several men went to great pains to justify her rule." Justify her rule to whom and for what? Only her gender?
So you see, if you consider Razia, who is the most quoted example of a woman ruler in the past, Razia is known to dress like a man and adopt male titles, so that yes, she's a woman, but she can make herself acceptable like an honorary male. So in a way, she's apologizing for her femininity, but she's saying, I can exercise power, I can sit on this throne because I'm actually a male. And a lot of rulers actually did that. But the women rulers of early medieval Kashmir and Orissa, the Baumakara rulers, did not. They were very unapologetically women, and adopted female titles, and did not particularly care that the populace saw them as women, because of course it differs. In early medieval Orissa, they were seen as successive inheritors of the throne. So it has a lot to do with the kind of tribal milieu and the general acceptance of women as wielders of power to a particular point. In early medieval Kashmir, women actually appropriated the power. They were not seen, they were seen up to a point as legitimate occupants of the throne, but a couple of these very remarkable women rulers, particularly this 10th century ruler called Didda, she she more or less eliminated all the male contenders to the throne around her because she felt they were useless, and that she actually had a better chance of giving the kingdom peace and prosperity. So she was extremely clear about the fact that, somebody worthy should be on the throne, and that is me. So, and she actually gave Kashmir a period of peace and prosperity that hadn't seen before or since. So, but again, that also has to do a bit with the tribal milieu of ancient and early medieval Kashmir, where, in a tribal setting, I think women are given more visibility and more agency than quintessential patriarchal, a setting where there are established caste rules and, you know inheritance rights and so on, where a woman is automatically devalued.
Right. From a modern perspective, when we think of women's rights and gender studies, we first think of women as being victims of a male patriarchy. But your study actually expands that thought and brings in something else. For instance, the implicit acceptance of women rulers through history tells me that maybe the problem is that historians have depicted women and their rule in a skewed modern perspective, and maybe the problem was not with the subjects of their kingdoms.
Absolutely. In fact, it's modern texts and modern historians who carry a heavier load of gender blindness than people in the past that we're talking about.
Right. And if
Yeah.
there had been an active, strong bias against the woman ruler,
Then they wouldn't have been allowed.
anything, yeah.
Yeah, it would not have worked.
Exactly. That's what I got from your study. Anyway, to my unschooled mind, it's a completely new thought.
There is another point that, these constant prescriptions in your literature about the manner in which a woman should behave and all the rules that circumvent them. The constant reiteration shows that women were probably challenging these rules over and over again, and transgressing the space allowed to them, which is why you need to keep repeating it and keep endorsing it and keep saying, no, this is their position, this is what they have to do, because obviously they weren't going to sit in that domestic space and quietly obey what was handed down to them. And that is something that gets eclipsed in all narratives of the past. It is so that's why you get these ludicrous suggestions of women across a huge time span and chronological space having the same status, same high status or the same low status. And basically the focus in most narratives, particularly in school textbooks, is on what they wore and their jewelry, as if to say that women were getting up throughout the past and obsessing daily about what to wear, while the men went out and did the real things and fought the battles and.
Exactly. And I can see what you mean by saying that it's an anachronistic narrative of history. Now, in one of your footnotes, I can't remember now on which page, you raised the question that Cynthia Talbot raised.
Yeah.
And I quote, "Thus, if women were actually able to shape public political outcomes, albeit through the indirect exercise of power, is it still meaningful to talk of divided spheres?"
Exactly.
Sort of speaks to the question, doesn't it?
Yeah. So you cannot have the public spheres reserved exclusively for men and the private domestic sphere is for women, because women were in both spaces, all the time.
Okay, then what was the burden of patriarchy back then? Were the biases not immutable? Were they negotiable?
No, there were clearly there were clear non-patriarchal possibilities within the overarching patriarchal edifice. As I said, there was definitely a certain amount of transgressive space that they might have carved for themselves or that they were allowed,
Right.
which enabled them to bridge this gap between domestic and public or private and public, and for us to acknowledge the fact that power is not just like formal authority. There are other kinds of power. There's indirect power, like being the power behind the throne, for example. Yeah, or just manipulation, coercion, coaxing, right? There's so many different ways in which
Behind every successful man?
or whatever. In this case, behind every successful woman.
Well, this whole thing is a refreshing thought, actually, because the popular perception is that only men had the throne by birthright. But that's not the case in many kingdoms.
No.
In many cases, daughters had an equal right to the throne in many kingdoms. Now, I'm itching to quote a little more from your study. May I?
Sure. Sure.
Okay, here's one. Strong tribal mores could be one of the reasons behind the royal women of the Baumakara dynasty being able to create a largely autonomous space for themselves in the political context. And later in that passage, patriarchal norms governing succession and women's powers, or the lack of them, were capable of being subverted or transgressed. I had a bit of a problem with the semantics in that sentence. So, women's powers or lack of norms governing women's powers, which, would you like me to read it?
Yeah.
Sure. Patriarchal norms governing succession and women's powers or lack of them.
The lack of, okay. The lack of power, not the norms. It refers to the lack of power or the seeming lack of power.
Good. That's what I thought. Thank you. Wonderful. Now, a lot of your research has been based on plates and symbols that you found.
Yeah, a lot of epigraphic evidence, inscription.
Yes,
Yeah.
epigraphic evidence from inscriptions and so on. Could you give me an example of how those epigraphs worked as research for you?
Okay, could I explain this with reference to both coins and inscriptions? Because there are.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
So let me give you an example from the Baumakara dynasty of Orissa, where and one of my books called Queen of Earth for young adults is based on this ruler called Prithvi Mahadevi, whose father actually kills the Baumakara ruler and places her on the throne. So she's basically ruling over a hostile populace and has to hold her own in a male-dominated environment.
Okay.
And she decides that although there are two male heirs in the offing, she decides that she will sort of hide their identity or do away with them and say that she is the one who will continue ruling on the throne despite their presence. So she issues this inscription which says that the previous heir to the throne died without children, and which is not true because he had two children. So so that's a very public document. When you issue an inscription, it's a public record. It's probably read out in court. It's put up where people can see it. So she very cleverly, through her inscription, uses words it in such a way that she gives legitimacy to her rule and removes all threats, impending threats, because if she says that there are no heirs to this throne, I am the one who needs to rule here, then there is no question of anybody coming up and challenging her right to be there. So that's a very clever use of an inscription. She's actually telling you a very different story. And this inscription has actually not been used in the manner it should be to reconstruct history, because it's just seen as, oh my God, woman on the throne. This signifies a downfall of the Baumakara dynasty. That's the usual equation in historians' minds. When you come to coins, they can tell you a very interesting story, and it depends again on the question that you have in your mind when you're looking at the coin. Now, supposing I'm looking at early medieval Kashmir and I see a coin. If I'm a historian interested in in the economics of it, I might say, okay, so this is the denomination, and this is the metal used, and this is the proportion, and that this is what it was used for. But being a gender historian, if I'm looking at it, it can tell you a really interesting story. For example, Didda, the queen I was talking about earlier, who ruled 10th century Kashmir, she actually marries the king of Kashmir, and he becomes so fascinated by her that he cannot let her out of his sight, and he becomes known by this nickname which has her name attached to his, like Brangelina or Wilcat of modern times. So his name is Shema Gupta, and he's known as Didak Shema by the people at large. And in fact, the coins that he issues have the name Didak Shema on them. So if you're looking at them, you will just see it as a random name if you're not interested in this question. But if you're looking at it from the gender point of view, you will say, oh my goodness, like she exercised so much power over him that he actually documented this fact on a coin and had it circulated in his empire. It was used, by the people at large. There's a whole series of Didak Shema coins, and she actually rules more or less, because he's an ineffective ruler. She rules during his lifetime and then takes over the throne. So it's actually it shows its indications of her, building, power and like accumulating enough influence in order to be able to stake a claim to the throne.
That's fascinating.
sources can really tell you a really fascinating story depending on whether you're open to these stories.
This is Dan Brown level cipher stuff. All right, now for Train to Tanjore. What a lovely way to tell a story based on history. So you mentioned that your dad's childhood had something to do with it, but tell us, what led you to write that book?
So actually, when my publisher Shayani Basu approached me to write a book for the Songs of Freedom series, which are based on childhood experiences during the freedom movement, I thought a lot, and of course, my initial reaction was to think of some woman again, some girl growing up somewhere, and then. And then it suddenly struck me that, I have grown up hearing my father's stories of what he did during the 1942 agitation and basically about Tanjore and how he grew up there and how the experience of freedom was different in the North than, what we normally get to hear about the Delhi-centric view or the North-centric view. And how they were more worried about the Japanese than about, other things. And so it just suddenly just slid into my mind as a story that I could write, and this was actually a really very enjoyable experience for me, because so far what I write about or who I write about is normally people who are who've passed on, and I'm just looking at sources, and it's a very solitary process because I'm just dealing with just the facts and trying to reconstruct them in my mind. But here for the first time I was dealing with a living source, and I could actually just pick up the phone and call him and say, okay, so what did you think about this, and how did you what is this experience all about, and Jenny checking things with him and having these long conversations. And so the whole process was really just so enjoyable.
But the main protagonist in your book is your dad, isn't it?
When I read the book again, now that it's published, it is him. He still has these very clear, characteristics: his intelligence, his quick temper, his impatience, all that. So
You capture that Brahmin orthodoxy of the time rather well.
I do.
So well. For example, the attitude and the character and the arrogance of the father's older brother, for instance.
Yes.
It's a sort of example of patriarchy above question, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And it's an arrogance that is delivered in the most base, unintelligent ways.
Yes.
Now, that was too real for it not to be someone in your family. So go ahead, spill. Who?
I shouldn't be revealing family secrets, but most of it is true. So,
I figured. I guess.
Yeah.
That story is told from the perspective of a young boy. Now, that story would have been remarkably different if it was written from the perspective of a young girl. For instance, she at the time wouldn't be standing outside a restaurant, her nose twitching for sambar and idli.
No. No.
Forbidden. Huh? And that's just idli and sambar. Now, mutton biryani would have been out of the question, wouldn't it?
Oh my goodness, yeah. You won't even get into onions, forget about it.
The young boy's character reminded me so much of that kid, William.
Oh, yes, William Richmond Crompton.
Richmond Crompton, yeah.
Yes.
That story was also set in the same time period as yours. In fact, in one story, William is most concerned that Hitler would invade England and take away his cricket bat. Totally delightful. Now tell me, do the inevitable comparisons with Arcane Narayan bother you any?
Oh, okay. Are they? I mean, okay, I haven't even got that.
What? Am I the first?
Yes. No one said this before. And wow, I'm deeply honored. I mean, I hope people don't think it's derivative or anything, but yeah, great.
Oh, not in the least derivative. That's not what I meant at all. And it won't be, I don't think it'll be taken that way in the least. But you see, you write about this young boy in that time frame, set in time, and the sentiment is rich. And it does evoke R.K. Narayan Swami and friends to a considerable degree.
that makes me feel very good about my writing of this book. Yeah, I mean, I love his Malgudi series. I mean, it's so alive and so relatable, and just gets inside the child's mind.
As indeed you did. So, what's the next book you're writing now?
So the next book I'm writing is actually out, hopefully in November. This is for adults, and this is narrative nonfiction on the Mauryan dynasty. So it has all the facts, but it's the attempt is to tell it with a lot of humor, and, with a lot of stories
Interesting.
that therefore doesn't seem too intimidating, because you are getting facts, but it's sort of sugar coated. So let's see. I mean, it's my first attempt to write this kind of prose for adults, and I'm hoping it works.
Well, I can't wait to read that book, and I hope that you will come back on the show with that book.
Would love to.
Well, more power to your elbow, and I look forward to reading everything else that you're going to write.
Thank you so much, Ram.
And Devika Rangachari, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Thank you so much, Ramji. I've loved this conversation, and I enormously admire what you do. I mean,
Well, I do nothing.
Talking to
You do all the
writers and-
serious work, and I just sit here and talk.
but you actually have to read the tomes to be able to talk to people. So that is some amount of serious commitment.
Oh, I could think of worse ways to spend my time.
That is true.
But thank you, Devika. This was delightful. That was Devika Rangachari, author of Train to Tanjore. There's a link in the podcast description to where you can buy that book. And I'll be back with What's That Word? That delightful segment where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time, but never stop to think about. And I'm back with What's That Word? And to help me with it, I would love to introduce my co-host to you, but she likes doing it herself.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello yourself, P with an A. You know, I noticed that you were listening to Devika Rangachari with some raptness.
Raptness, that's a nice word. Is it a real word?
Yes, I didn't make it up, although I should have.
No, I was just trying to place it. You know, sometimes it helps to understand a word by finding out the opposite.
Yeah.
So, what's the opposite of raptness?
What did you just say?
Very funny, okay?
Okay, many. You know, inattentiveness, abstraction, distraction, absent-mindedness.
Cool, thanks. And yes, I was listening to Devika Rangachari with raptness. And again, great interview.
Thank you.
Did you really read her thesis in one sitting, though?
What do you mean? Do you suppose that I would be a tad liberal with the truth about reading a thesis to the author of the thesis?
No, I wasn't saying that. I was trying to give you a compliment.
No need.
Well, I really liked her. And how wonderful to know that women rulers ruled by their own right and not by the permission of men.
Right, yes. You know, it adds up, doesn't it? The way I see it, we always hear of unpopular rulers or rulers who didn't have the proper mandate being deposed or killed or dethroned. But there's not much evidence that these queens were killed merely for being women.
Right, that's heartening. But it goes to the point you guys were discussing, and that is that the writing of history may have been what caused a skew towards men and trivialized women.
Right.
White male gender blindness, to paraphrase her.
It's true. That's what she said. And, you know, I'm quite sure those ladies, those queens, suffered other biases, and some of them, I dare say, may have been gender-based too. But again, in our narrow context, everyone always faces some bias, especially if you're ruling, you know, caste, class, skin color. If they were purple people, someone would hate them. Or just look at all of them purple people swanning around.
Right. To each of us, our battle.
Well said. Okay, P with an A. What's that word?
With all the talk of history and female rulers and also the Queen of Canada, Elizabeth, dying, my word today is queen.
Queen of Canada. Nice. Go ahead.
So, There are so many meanings to the word queen. From a female ruler to a gay reference. So let's try and include as many as we can.
Right.
So let's get to the etymology of queen.
The word is very interesting. So let's start with the PIE root.
Oh, goody.
Okay, so first queen, spelled Queen, was originally spelled with an A. That's queen with an A.
Everyone hits me with this now, thanks to you.
A sure sign of good ratings for us, I would say.
Yeah, okay, fine. But more etymology, please. You were saying Quean?
That's correct. That spelling was used in the early 15th century, and it had Proto-Indo-European roots, PIE, you see. These roots. Janus in Sanskrit, and also Gna, which means woman, but a figure of authority. I mean, Gna is a figure of authority, like a goddess, for instance. And in ancient Greek, gyne or gyne, you see, and this led to all the gyne words like gynecology, misogyny, androgyny.
That's interesting. I'd never put those words together.
Yeah. And also banshee, another word to describe feminine.
Hey, did you just throw that in there?
No, I didn't, and you can Google it, but I couldn't resist.
I believe you. And also, no wonder we keep getting trivialized.
Oh, well, I agree. But this, important to our context today, led to the word Gwen, which originally meant woman. And you see how Gwen morphs quite easily into queen?
Yeah, wow, that is so interesting. But wait, in that case, Gwen Stefani.
I looked it up specifically.
And?
Well, so while Gwen is short for Gwendolen and the like, which is from the Welsh, some say that it could also have come from, Guinevere, King Arthur's wife and Sir Lancelot's main squeeze.
And she was a queen.
Well, Gwen is the word that predates queen. Yes, queen, both with and without an A.
I'll take with an A. Rule Queen Stefani. And now, the different ways the word queen has been used.
Right. I will dwell on two of those today.
Right. And one is the gay reference.
Yes, correct. But first, the reference to queen as a center of power.
Yay.
Think about it. We have the queen bee, the bee who's the ruler of the hive, and all the other bees rally around her. And in chess, we like chess, the queen is the most important piece. The king just sits around until it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. Like the king of the jungle is the lion,
Yeah.
but everyone knows it's the lioness that hunts and brings home the food.
A kept man.
You mean man?
I'll take that. Okay, now in the gay reference, the word queen refers to a gay man who is very feminine in appearance and demeanor.
Yeah, but why though? I mean, how did that come to be?
So some years ago, I asked a gay friend of mine in New York, and he explained that the queen, in reference to a feminine man, was a sign of a flamboyant person.
Yeah, that makes sense. But would it be an insult to refer to a flamboyant, feminine-looking gay man as queen? I mean, not that I plan to.
Actually asked that question, and I understand that depends on how you mean it and how you say it. So it can be a pejorative if you're trying to make it one, but also that it's just a manner of identity, self-identification.
And why not wear the queen label with pride?
You mean like call kings queens?
Yes, exactly.
Do you remember that TV station in Africa recently that called King Charles the new Queen of England?
I remember that.
It didn't exactly set the woke brigade ecstatic with gender bender approval now, did it?
You're right, it didn't.
But in gay speak, a man who impersonates a drag queen is also called a faux king.
Delightful.
But if I were you, I wouldn't say faux king too quickly.
That's my cue. Bye.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank my guest, Devika Rangachari, and my co-host, Pranati P. with an A, Mother. Now go hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of The Literary City. And I will see you again next Wednesday.